Hello and welcome to the video on absorption costing. In this video, I'm going to go through the concept of absorption costing. We will look at an example and try to find how to allocate an absorption cost or a full cost to a job unit. Absorption costing, or sometimes referred to as full costing method, is a method of allocating cost to a job unit by taking into consideration both the direct cost as well as a fair share of the indirect costs associated with servicing that particular job unit. It is a widely used method of allocating cost also because it is mandated by the generally accepted accounting principles for external reporting. For example, let's say a consultancy firm. Each client who comes to the consultancy firm represents a job unit. Similarly, each patient coming to a hospital represents a job unit. The first step is to allocate all the direct costs associated with servicing that job unit. And then the total indirect cost spent in the business for that particular period is divided by the number of job units the business has in that period. This gives a allocation rate, and based on the allocation rate, a proportional fair share of the indirect cost is associated to the job unit. Absorption cost allocates all fixed overhead cost to the job unit, whether or not it has been sold or serviced in that period. That is one of a limitation associated with the absorption costing method. To see how the absorption costing works in practice, let's take a simplistic example of a business, a hospital, which treats patients. Each patient coming to the hospital represents a job unit for that business. For simplistic purpose, let's consider that this business has one element of indirect cost, which is the salary paid to the receptionist. To bill patient X, the first consideration is a direct cost, which includes both the direct material and the direct labor element. So to allocate cost for patient X, we will first consider how many direct care hours the patient has used. That will be the proportion of direct labor. Second, we'll consider how much of material was used to service this patient. So the cost of the medication would be the direct material cost allocation. In this business, as we earlier mentioned, there is one element of indirect cost, which is the cost or salary of the receptionist. The business would use the cost allocation base to estimate a fair share of the overhead that needs to be billed for patient X. Now, this cost allocation base in this particular case would be labor hours. In most businesses, that is the case. However, when the manufacturing process is very machine driven, then the cost allocation base could also be machine hours. To allocate the fair share of overhead to patient X, we will take the total indirect cost in the business for a period and divide it with the total indirect labor hours associated with that business. This will give us an allocation rate. This allocation rate will be used to estimate the indirect cost in proportion to the total direct labor hours that has been associated with this patient. By doing this, we are allocating both the direct as well as the indirect costs associated with the cost object, i.e. patient X. Let's try and put some numbers to the previous explanation. So let's consider a hospital which has a £10,000 per month indirect cost associated with the salary of the receptionist. Let's say in that period, the total indirect labor hours were 500 hours. A patient that visits hospital A incurred a direct material cost of £50 and was treated by a doctor for 5 hours who is paid at a rate of £30 an hour. So we know that this material and labors are the direct costs associated with the treatment. What we're expecting to find is the full cost of how much we should bill patient X. This can be done in 2 steps. In the first step, we calculate the overhead allocation rate, which is nothing but a division of the total overhead costs and divided with the units in the allocation base. In this case is the indirect labor hours. The second step is using the direct material, direct labor, and adding on the fair share of the overhead. So estimating the absorption costing for the previous example, the first step is estimating the overhead allocation rate. We take the total overhead cost in the business, £10,000, and divide it with the units in the allocation base. In this particular case, the indirect labor hours is the allocation base, 500 in the business. That gives us an overhead allocation rate of £20 per labor hours. The next step is estimating the full cost, which we take into consideration the direct material, £50, the direct labor, which is 5 hours of servicing patient X, charged at the rate of £30 an hour, £150, and ultimately the overhead allocated using the overhead allocation rate calculated in step 1, £20, multiplied by 5. The reason we are using 5 is because this particular patient used 5 direct labor hours. And the reason we are using the 5 direct labor hours because the unit in the allocation base is labor hours. That gives a £100 allocation on overhead. So the total bill for patient X will be £300. Couple of things to note. First, out of the total £10,000 indirect cost in the business, the patient X gets £100 allotted to him. That is considered a fair share of indirect costs associated with servicing patient X. Moreover, one of the limitations of absorption costing method is that every expense is allocated to the manufacturing product, whether or not they are sold by the end of that period. So in a service context, like the example of the hospital, it makes sense. However, when we consider manufacturing process where products could be manufactured, cost allocation could be done, but that product may or may not be sold in the same accounting period, then there might be some issues associated with the absorption costing allocation.